Right now, there is a chemical steadily accumulating in your brain. Hour by hour, as long as you are awake, it builds up, creating a physical pressure so intense that eventually you will have absolutely no choice but to shut down. Welcome to TalkKast.
That is a remarkably intense way to frame something that most of us just think of as getting tired.
Well, it is intense because it's an inescapable biological reality, which is why I'm so glad we were talking about this, because we spend roughly a third of our lives doing it, yet most of us fundamentally misunderstand what is actually happening.
I think the common assumption is that sleep is just, a biological off switch. It feels like a blank space between the days where we simply do nothing.
Exactly. We tend to view it as a state of absence. But if you look at the brain and the body during sleep, it is actually the most intense, active, biological maintenance phase of our entire day. It completely shifts how we need to think about rest.
It makes me wonder about other forms of rest, because a lot of people feel that lying on the couch, watching television, or just sitting quietly achieves the exact same goal.
I totally fall into that trap myself. I will spend an hour reading on the couch and think, well, I am giving my brain a break. But the biological distinction is incredibly clear. You can sit quietly and feel physically relaxed, sure.
Your muscles get a break, and your heart rate might even slow down a bit.
But that kind of waking rest does not trigger the profound internal shifts that true sleep does. When you actually cross the threshold into sleep, your brain initiates these highly specific electrical wave changes.
So it's not just a matter of lowering your physical activity level.
Not at all. Your body undergoes massive hormonal shifts, and your immune system activates in ways that simply cannot happen when you are conscious. True sleep triggers literal cleaning cycles in the brain that flush out metabolic waste.
That sounds like a highly structured repair mode, rather than just shutting off.
It is exactly that. You might be able to fake resting by lying very still, but you absolutely cannot fake sleep. And because that maintenance is so deeply vital, the body requires a foolproof mechanism to force us into it.
Which brings us back to that chemical pressure you mentioned right at the start. How does the body actually track when we need this repair mode?
It relies on two invisible forces. The first is sleep pressure, which acts like an internal homeostat. The chemical driving this pressure is called adenosine. Every single cell in your body uses a molecule called ATP for basic energy.
Okay, so that is the fundamental fuel source for keeping us alive and moving.
Yes, and when your cells burn that energy just by keeping you conscious and functioning, adenosine is left behind as a byproduct. From the very moment you wake up, this adenosine starts piling up in the brain.
So it is essentially the exhaust fumes of simply being awake.
That is a perfect way to look at it. As the hours pass, this adenosine continues to accumulate. It circulates around and literally binds to specific receptor sites in your brain.
And I assume as more of those receptors get filled, the brain starts to react.
It does. As those receptors fill up, they begin to inhibit the wake-promoting regions of the brain, and simultaneously they stimulate the sleep-promoting regions. You feel this physically as an increasing heavy weight of sleepiness.
So the longer you are awake, the greater this chemical pressure becomes.
Precisely. Eventually, the adenosine concentration gets so high that your brain has to sleep simply to clear the chemical away and reset the entire system.
That makes total biological sense, but it immediately raises a real-world problem for me. If adenosine physically fills up those receptors to make us tired, how does a cup of coffee completely erase that feeling?
That is the ultimate question, isn't it?
I can drink an espresso late in the afternoon when my adenosine should be really high, and I feel entirely awake. It seems to contradict the whole idea of an inescapable pressure.
Well, it seems like a contradiction until you look at the actual molecular shape of caffeine. Caffeine does not erase adenosine at all, and it certainly does not erase your biological need for sleep.
So what is it actually doing in the brain?
It operates by hijacking the mechanism. The caffeine molecule happens to be shaped similarly enough to adenosine that it can physically wedge itself into those exact same receptors.
Wait, it just blocks the slot so the adenosine can't get in?
Exactly. Caffeine doesn't activate the receptor to make you sleepy. It just sits there, blocking the actual adenosine from making contact. It acts like a piece of masking tape over the check engine light on your car's dashboard.
That is a great analogy. The underlying problem is still there, but you are temporarily blind to the warning signal because the sensor is covered up.
The engine is still struggling, but you just can't see the alert. And while that caffeine is occupying those receptors, your brain continues burning energy. The adenosine continues to build up in the background, just waiting in the wings.
So what happens when the caffeine finally wears off?
When your liver eventually metabolizes the caffeine and clears it out of those receptors, all of that accumulated adenosine floods in simultaneously.
Wow, so you get hit with everything at once.
Yeah. You don't just feel the tiredness you had when you drank the coffee. You feel all the tiredness that built up while the coffee was working, plus the original amount. That sudden, massive binding is what causes that crushing exhaustion people experience as a caffeine crash.
That explains so much about the mid-afternoon wall people hit. But if we have this rising tide of adenosine trying to force the brain to shut down, how do we stay awake all day?
That is where the second force comes in. If adenosine was the only mechanism, we would just pass out randomly in the middle of the afternoon the second the pressure got too high. There has to be a guardrail keeping us awake until night.
And what exactly is that guardrail?
It is your circadian rhythm. Deep inside the brain, sitting just above where the optic nerves cross, is a cluster of cells called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This acts as your master internal clock.
I have heard of the circadian clock, but how does it actually know what time it is?
It operates on an internal cycle that is roughly 24.25 hours long. Because it is slightly longer than a standard day, it has to rely on external cues to reset itself to exactly 24 hours every single day.
I assume the primary external cue has to be sunlight.
Light is the absolute dominant cue. When bright daylight enters your eyes in the morning, it hits specialized receptors in the retina that actually have nothing to do with visual sight.
So they exist purely to tell the brain about the light environment.
Yes. They send a direct signal to that master clock in the brain that it is time to be awake, effectively winding the clock back to the precise start of the day. This clock dictates your natural peaks and valleys of alertness, totally independent of how much sleep pressure you have.
That explains why you might feel a sudden wave of energy in the early evening, even if you have been awake for 14 hours and your adenosine levels are high.
Precisely. The clock is broadcasting a strong alert signal to keep you functional until nightfall. And understanding that internal clock mechanism completely changes how we should view melatonin.
I'm glad you brought up melatonin. People constantly talk about taking it as this powerful sedative. They treat it like a sleeping pill, expecting it to simply knock them out.
Treating melatonin as a tranquilizer is probably the most common misunderstanding about the hormone out there. Melatonin does not participate in the actual generation of sleep itself.
Wait, really? So it doesn't chemically make you unconscious?
Not at all. It is strictly a timing signal. When your circadian clock detects that it is getting dark outside, it signals the pineal gland to begin releasing melatonin into the bloodstream.
So it's basically just an internal announcement that the sun went down.
Exactly. Think of it as a chemical starting gun. It floods the brain and body with a message that simply says, "It is now night." It helps organize the timing of your sleep, letting all the internal systems know that the environment is dark and ready for the transition.
So taking a melatonin supplement in the middle of the afternoon wouldn't push you into a deep slumber?
No, it only attempts to shift the timing of when you feel ready to sleep. If you take it during the day, you aren't going to fall into a restorative sleep. You are just going to severely confuse your circadian rhythm.
It sounds like it creates a massive biological contradiction.
It does. For healthy sleep to happen, the circadian rhythm and the adenosine pressure must align perfectly. The high sleep pressure creates the biological drive, and the melatonin release opens the window of opportunity.
And once those two forces finally align and pull us under, what actually happens inside the brain?
That is when the actual architecture of the night begins. The descent into sleep is a highly structured biological journey. When you first close your eyes and begin to drift off, you enter stage 1 light sleep.
What does that transition feel like physically?
Your brain waves start to slow down from the rapid, chaotic rhythm of waking life into a much more synchronized pattern. Your heart rate and breathing follow suit. It is a fragile, transitional stage.
Is that when you get those sudden muscle jerks?
Yes, you might experience a sudden muscle twitch, known as a hypnic jerk, or feel like you are drifting in and out of awareness. You only spend a few minutes here before descending into stage 2.
And what is the purpose of stage 2? Is it just deeper resting?
Stage 2 is essentially the baseline of your night. We actually spend roughly half of our total sleep time in this stage. It is where the body temperature drops and you disconnect much further from the outside world.
So you are officially cut off from your environment at this point.
Pretty much. But the defining neurological feature of stage 2 is the appearance of something called sleep spindles.
Sleep spindles. That sounds like something out of a science fiction novel.
They are remarkable to look at on a monitor. They are rapid, intense bursts of electrical activity in the brain lasting just a second or two. And they serve dual purposes. First, they act as a sensory blockade, protecting the brain from external noises so you do not wake up easily.
That is fascinating. The brain actively shields itself from sound. What is the second purpose?
They are actively involved in the early stages of memory processing. They take newly acquired information from your day and prepare it for long-term storage. So stage 2 sets the foundation, but stage 3 is where the really heavy biological work begins.
Stage 3 is what people usually call deep sleep, right?
Yes, deep, slow-wave sleep. If you look at brain waves during stage 3, they are entirely different from anything in waking life. They become massive, synchronized, slow-sweeping delta waves. This is the ultimate power-down mode for your physical body.
How drastic are the physiological changes in this deep phase?
Incredibly drastic. Blood pressure drops to its lowest point of the entire 24-hour cycle. Blood flow is aggressively redirected away from the brain and shunted out into the muscles.
So the body is literally prioritizing the muscles over the brain for a period of time.
Absolutely. Your body also releases a massive surge of growth hormone during this stage. It is not just about feeling rested. This is when the body actively repairs micro tears in muscle tissue, regenerates cells, and heals physical wounds.
I assume that is why waking up from deep sleep feels so terrible.
Oh, it is the worst. If you try to wake someone up straight out of stage 3, they will be incredibly groggy and disoriented because their brain has essentially shut down the conscious circuits to prioritize this deep physical repair.
So if deep sleep is primarily for the physical body, where does REM sleep fit into all of this?
REM sleep, which stands for rapid eye movement, flips the entire script of the night. After you emerge from deep sleep, the brain eventually transitions into REM. During the stage, your brain activity completely skyrockets.
Skyrockets. I thought sleep was supposed to be a slow wave state.
Only in the deep stages. If you look at a monitor, a brain in REM sleep looks almost identical to a brain that is wide awake. The brain is burning massive amounts of energy to process complex emotions, organize information, and consolidate the abstract, intricate memories from your day.
And this is when dreaming happens, I assume.
Exactly. This is the stage where your most vivid narrative dreaming occurs. The brain is essentially hallucinating an entirely new reality, which actually presents a massive physical danger.
Because if your brain thinks you are running from a threat, your body would naturally try to execute those movements in bed.
Precisely. If you are fighting someone in a dream, you would end up punching the wall or your partner. But biology solved that problem with an ingenious safeguard called REM Atonia.
Atonia, what does that involve?
As you enter REM sleep, the brainstem sends a paralyzing signal down your spinal cord. This signal temporarily locks all of your major voluntary muscles. Your physical body stays completely motionless in bed, safe from acting out the internal hallucinations.
That is incredible. You are physically paralyzed while your brain is sprinting.
Yes, your eyes still dart back and forth under your eyelids, and your breathing can become a bit irregular, but your arms and legs are completely switched off.
So we go through stage 1, stage 2, deep sleep, and then REM. Do we just do that once and then wake up?
Not at all. The brain loops through these stages in highly orchestrated cycles that last roughly 90 minutes. But the crucial part, and this is where most people get into trouble, is that the architecture of these cycles is not uniform throughout the night.
What do you mean by not uniform? Doesn't every 90-minute cycle look the same?
No, the ratio of deep sleep to REM sleep changes drastically as the night progresses. The asymmetry of these cycles is vital to understand. In the first half of the night, your 90-minute cycles are heavily dominated by stage 3 deep sleep.
So the body prioritizes physical repair right out of the gate.
Exactly. You might get an hour of deep sleep and only 10 minutes of REM in an early cycle. But as you move past the midpoint of the night and into the early morning hours, the cycles invert.
So the deep sleep portions shrink down.
They shrink down to almost nothing, and the REM sleep portions expand dramatically. By the hours just before waking, you are spending the vast majority of your cycle in REM sleep, prioritizing mental and emotional repair.
That asymmetry highlights a massive problem with how we view sleep deprivation.
It really does. Think about it. If you normally sleep 8 hours, but you set your alarm to wake up after 5 hours because you have an early flight or a meeting, you might think you are just losing 30% of your overall sleep.
But you are actually disproportionately destroying your brain's REM supply.
Exactly. Because REM sleep is heavily concentrated in those final morning hours, shaving off the last 2 or 3 hours of your night means you might be losing 60 to 70% of your total REM sleep.
So you get the physical repair early in the night, but you effectively starve your brain of its primary emotional and cognitive restoration.
You completely starve it. And if we are starving the brain of that late-night cognitive repair, we have to look at the real-world consequences for our minds. The cognitive toll is absolutely devastating. Let's look at memory building first.
I feel like we often think of human memory like a computer hard drive that just instantly saves a file the moment an event happens.
We do, but human memory requires significant biological processing time. Sleep does not just passively store memories, it actively builds and solidifies them. When you learn something new during the day, the information is initially held in a region called the hippocampus.
And how secure is the information while it's in the hippocampus?
Not secure at all. The hippocampus acts like a temporary, fragile USB drive. The capacity is extremely limited, and the information is highly vulnerable to being overridden or just forgotten entirely. The brain needs what we can call glue time.
So sleep provides the glue time to transfer those memories.
Yes, specifically utilizing those sleep spindles we talked about in the REM cycles. The brain physically transfers the information. It replays the day's experiences, filters out the unnecessary noise, and shifts the important, fragile daytime learnings from the hippocampus into stable, long-term storage in the cortex.
Without that transfer process, the memory simply does not stick.
It doesn't. This proves that staying up all night to cram for an exam or prep for a major presentation is completely counterproductive. You are forcing new data into the temporary storage of the hippocampus, but you are deliberately denying the brain the sleep stages required to actually save that information.
That is a harsh reality for college students everywhere. Brain just drops the data.
It simply drops it. You lose the ability to recall the exact facts you sacrificed your sleep to memorize. But we don't just lose memory capacity. The cognitive damage goes far beyond forgetting facts. We also completely lose our emotional filter.
I definitely experienced that. I know that if I sleep poorly, my patience the next day is practically non-existent. Minor inconveniences feel like massive crises.
That emotional volatility is deeply rooted in the brain's anatomy. When you are deprived of REM sleep, a specific region called the amygdala becomes hyperreactive.
The amygdala is the fear center, right?
Exactly. It is essentially the brain's primitive alarm system. It is the center for fear, anger, and rapid emotional impulses. Under normal, rested conditions, the prefrontal cortex, which is the logical, rational part of your brain behind your forehead, acts as a manager.
So the prefrontal cortex keeps the amygdala in check and provides context to situations.
It does. But without sufficient REM sleep, that neural connection between the rational brain and the emotional brain is effectively severed.
Wow, so the amygdala just runs completely out of control without any managerial oversight.
Exactly. The brain fails to process negative emotions properly. Situations that are completely neutral suddenly feel threatening, offensive, or deeply antagonistic. You overreact to minor annoyances or snap at colleagues because your brain has lost the neurological brakes that keep your reactions proportional to reality.
Beyond the emotional instability, isn't there a literal change in how a sleep-deprived brain perceives the physical world?
Yes, it begins to experience frightening lapses in basic awareness known as microsleeps. When your brain is exhausted, the adenosine sleep pressure becomes so immense that it will eventually force sleep upon you, regardless of what you are doing.
I have heard of microsleeps, but what actually happens during one?
A microsleep is a sudden, uncontrollable lapse into a sleep state that lasts for just a fraction of a second to a few seconds. And the terrifying part is that during a microsleep, your eyes can remain completely open.
Wait, you can be asleep with your eyes wide open.
You can. You look awake, but your visual perception and reaction times drop to absolute zero. The brain becomes completely blind to the outside world. Operating a vehicle while chronically sleep-deprived perfectly mimics alcohol intoxication.
That is a terrifying comparison.
It is functionally identical to driving legally drunk. The brain simply cannot maintain continuous conscious awareness when the pressure is that high.
Okay, so we have established that the brain is effectively crippled without full sleep cycles. But the physical breakdown must be just as severe, right?
It is catastrophic. Skipping the early night deep sleep wreaks absolute havoc on our metabolism, our heart, and our immune system. Let's unpack the metabolic side first, because the connection between sleep and weight gain is staggering.
How does sleep actually affect weight? Is it just about having less energy to exercise?
It is much deeper than that. Sleep exercises strict control over the hormones that regulate your appetite, specifically leptin and ghrelin. Leptin is the hormone that signals satiety. It communicates to your brain that you are full and do not need to consume more calories.
And ghrelin is the opposite, the hunger hormone.
Right, ghrelin tells your brain that you need energy immediately. When you restrict your sleep, this delicate hormonal balance completely inverts. Your leptin levels plummet, silencing the signal that you are full.
And I assume the ghrelin levels spike at the exact same time.
They spiked dramatically, broadcasting a massive false signal of starvation. Being tired actually forces your body to feel hungrier. It is not a subtle shift either. When people cut their sleep from a healthy 8 hours down to 5 hours, they unconsciously consume about 300 extra calories the next day.
300 extra calories just from being tired. And I bet it is not 300 calories in vegetables either.
Definitely not. The sleep-deprived brain does not crave healthy foods. Because the body is desperate for quick energy to combat the exhaustion, it specifically targets high carbohydrate, high sugar foods for a rapid glucose rush.
And because your prefrontal cortex is impaired from the lack of REM, you probably lose the willpower to resist those cravings.
You lose the neurological ability to say no. To make the metabolic situation even worse, your blood sugar regulation severely falters. When you lack deep sleep, your body loses its normal ability to effectively clear glucose from the blood.
So the cells stop responding to insulin properly.
Yes, the cells become resistant to insulin, dropping you into a biological state that effectively mimics prediabetes. You are eating more sugar, and your body is less capable of managing it.
That sets the stage for a rapid weight gain. But what about the cardiovascular system? You mentioned earlier that blood pressure drops during deep sleep.
Yes, the heart normally relies heavily on deep sleep for its own essential recovery. During stage 3, your body goes through a process we call the dip. Your blood pressure drops by 10 to 20%, and your heart rate slows significantly.
So this is the one continuous period where the cardiovascular system gets a break.
It is the only time in the 24-hour cycle where your heart gets to ease the pressure on your blood vessels, lower the mechanical strain, and actually repair itself. When you shortchange your sleep, you deny your heart that essential dip.
Which means the heart just stays under high pressure constantly.
Exactly. It stays in a state of high sympathetic nervous system activity for far too long. Your heart rate remains elevated, and your blood pressure stays high. This continuous, relentless strain drastically increases the long-term risk of hypertension, stroke, and cardiovascular disease.
You are essentially running the engine in the red zone without ever letting it idle.
That is exactly what you're doing, and the immune system also takes a massive hit. It relies on that same deep sleep window to fortify its defenses. It is the precise time when your immune system builds biological memory.
Biological memory, like remembering how to fight off specific viruses.
Yes. While you are in deep, slow-wave sleep, your body ramps up the production of infection-fighting cells and antibodies. It coordinates its defense strategies against pathogens. The clinical importance of this is incredibly clear when we look at vaccination efficacy.
Does sleep actually change how well a vaccine works?
Drastically. If you get poor sleep in the days immediately surrounding a vaccination, it actually weakens your body's antibody response. Without sufficient deep sleep, the immune system simply cannot synthesize a strong defense memory.
That leaves you much more vulnerable to contracting whatever you were just vaccinated against.
It leaves you incredibly vulnerable. And if you do get sick, the lack of sleep dramatically slows down your recovery time. But beyond the immune system, there is one more critical physical process that happens strictly during deep sleep, and it involves the physical structure of the brain itself.
The physical structure. What happens to the brain physically?
It involves the glymphatic system, which is one of the most remarkable discoveries in recent biology. During the day, as your brain cells fire and consume vast amounts of energy, they leave behind metabolic waste products in the brain tissue.
Waste products like what?
This includes toxic proteins, such as amyloid beta. When you enter deep sleep, a literal physical transformation occurs in the brain. The glial cells, which are the supporting cells around your neurons, actually shrink slightly.
Wait, the brain cells physically alter their size?
Yes, the cells shrink, which causes the physical spaces between the brain cells to expand by up to 60%.
Expanding by 60% is a massive structural shift.
It is huge. And this sudden expansion allows cerebrospinal fluid to rush into the brain tissue and vigorously wash over the cells. It sweeps away all of the toxic proteins and metabolic garbage that built up during the waking hours, flushing it out of the brain and into the circulatory system for disposal.
It is literally a nightly power wash cycle for your brain.
That's exactly what it is. If you skimp on deep sleep, those spaces do not expand sufficiently, the fluid does not flow properly, and those toxic proteins are left to fester and accumulate.
And I imagine the long-term accumulation of those proteins is incredibly dangerous.
It is heavily linked to cognitive decline and neurodegenerative conditions. The brain essentially poisons itself if it cannot perform this wash cycle.
So we have established that sleep is foundational to every major system: emotional regulation, metabolism, cardiovascular health, and brain detoxification. The obvious question is, if sleep is this vital, why is it so hard for us to get?
It's hard because we have adopted modern habits that directly wage war on our biology. We use tools to try and manage our energy that actually destroy our sleep architecture. And the most deceptive of these saboteurs is alcohol.
That is a big one. So many people rely on a nightcap, a glass of wine or whiskey right before bed, because it acts quickly to calm them down.
They feel like it solves their sleep issues because they lose consciousness quickly. But alcohol creates a very powerful, very dangerous illusion. It will absolutely sedate you faster, but sedation is fundamentally different from sleep.
How is sedation different? Aren't you still resting?
Sedation is just a chemical suppression of brain activity. You are knocking out the cortex, but you are not initiating the complex orchestrated brain waves of true sleep. Once you are sedated, the alcohol goes to work dismantling the structure of your night.
So it actually harms the sleep cycles we just talked about.
It completely aggressively fragments your sleep. As the body metabolizes the alcohol, it creates a rebound effect in the nervous system. This causes you to wake up briefly dozens of times throughout the night.
Dozens of times. Most people don't remember waking up that often.
You often do not even remember these micro-awakenings, but they completely destroy the continuity of your rest. More importantly, alcohol is one of the most powerful blockers of REM sleep that we consume.
So it specifically attacks the emotional and cognitive repair stage.
Yes, the chemical byproducts of alcohol metabolism suppress the brain's ability to generate rapid eye movement sleep. Even if you stay unconscious for 8 hours after drinking, your brain is starved of the crucial dream sleep it needs. You wake up with light, unrefreshing sleep, feeling totally drained.
Another major disruption has to be our environment, specifically all the artificial light we surround ourselves with late into the evening.
That goes right back to the circadian clock and melatonin. For the vast majority of human history, sunset meant darkness, and darkness signaled the pineal gland to release melatonin.
But today, we stare directly into screens, emitting intense blue light until the exact minute we close our eyes.
And that is a huge problem. Tablets, phones, and televisions emit light on a wavelength that strongly stimulates those specific daytime receptors in the eye. This tricks the brain into believing the sun is still shining high in the sky.
Which completely suppresses the release of melatonin, right?
It suppresses it entirely and pushes the timing signal back by hours. You are trying to force your brain to power down and sleep while simultaneously flooding your eyes with signals telling your master clock that it is still daytime. The biological signals are in total conflict.
This constant struggle with exhaustion leads a lot of people to believe that they can just power through. High performers always claim they have trained their bodies to thrive on 5 or 6 hours of sleep a night.
The short sleeper myth is incredibly pervasive, but the biological reality is that you cannot train yourself to need less sleep, any more than you can train yourself to need less oxygen or fewer calories.
But aren't there some people who genuinely don't need 8 hours?
There is a rare genetic mutation, often referred to as the DEC2 gene, that allows a tiny fraction of the population to genuinely survive on 6 hours or less without measurable impairment. However, this applies to roughly 1 to 3% of the population.
That is an incredibly small number. It means basically everyone claiming to be a short sleeper is just exhausted.
Exactly. For the other 97% of us, trying to survive on short sleep simply creates a state of chronic deficit. You do not adapt to less sleep, you just become accustomed to feeling terrible.
So they establish a baseline of feeling bad and just think that's normal life.
You establish a new normal of subtle impairment. Your memory is worse, your mood is volatile, and your physical health is compromised. But because you are perpetually in this state, you lack the baseline of feeling truly rested to even recognize the decline.
When people finally realize they're exhausted, they usually try to fix it by binge sleeping on the weekends. I am totally guilty of this.
Most of us are. We figure if we deprive ourselves all week and then sleep an extra 4 hours on Sunday, we are wiping the slate clean and banking energy for Monday. But the biology shows that you cannot bank sleep and you cannot pay off a massive cellular debt in 2 days.
Why doesn't that work? Aren't you getting the hours back?
Because you are destroying your internal clock. When you wake up at vastly different times on the weekend compared to the weekday, you create a phenomenon known as social jet lag.
Social jet lag, like you literally traveled across the world.
Precisely. By sleeping until noon, you drag your circadian rhythm forward. Come Monday morning, when your alarm goes off at 6, your internal clock still thinks it is the middle of the night. Your body feels exactly as if you just flew across multiple time zones.
That explains why Monday mornings feel so physically painful.
Binge sleeping fragments your biological timing, meaning you start the new work week exhausted, disoriented, and completely out of sync with your environment.
Okay, knowing all of these pitfalls, the alcohol, the blue light, the fragmented schedules, how do we actually fix our sleep? We obviously need to transition from focusing purely on the hours in bed to optimizing the actual quality of rest.
The first step in realigning your sleep is learning to listen to your mornings. We are obsessed with counting the 8 hours we spend in bed, but 8 hours in bed does not guarantee 8 hours of high-quality sleep. The true test of your sleep efficiency is how you feel when you wake up.
So if you are sleeping 8 hours but waking up feeling completely heavy and exhausted, that is a red flag.
It is a massive red flag. Similarly, if you rely on a blaring, anxiety-inducing alarm clock to drag you out of unconsciousness, or if you need 3 cups of coffee just to feel human by 10 in the morning, your body is loudly telling you that its sleep needs were not met.
Could waking up exhausted despite getting enough hours be a sign of a medical issue?
Absolutely. It is often a hidden symptom of an underlying issue disrupting your sleep architecture, like sleep apnea. With sleep apnea, the airway partially collapses and you stop breathing multiple times an hour, which completely destroys your deep sleep.
Because the brain has to wake you up to start breathing again.
Exactly. The brain briefly wakes you up to restore breathing, preventing you from ever getting the continuous stage 3 repair, even though you never remember waking up.
What about naps? People use naps to bridge the gap during the day. Do they actually help clear the deficit, or do they just ruin your sleep pressure for the upcoming night?
Naps can be highly effective, but it depends entirely on the duration and the timing. If you utilize a 20 to 30-minute power nap in the early afternoon, it can be incredibly restorative.
Because it keeps you in the lighter stages of sleep.
Right. A short nap keeps you in stage 1 and stage 2 sleep. It allows you to shave off just enough of that accumulated adenosine, the sleep pressure, to improve your alertness for the rest of the day without letting you cross over into deep stage 3 sleep.
But if you nap for too long or too late in the day, it backfires.
It becomes incredibly destructive. If you sleep for 90 minutes or take a nap late in the evening, you drain away far too much sleep pressure. When your actual bedtime arrives, you simply will not have enough adenosine built up to pull you under.
So you just lie awake staring at the ceiling.
And that fragments your entire nighttime schedule and perpetuates the cycle of insomnia. Establishing a reliable, high-quality sleep schedule requires practical behavioral changes that align with those two invisible forces, the circadian clock and the adenosine pressure.
What are the non-negotiable habits we need to adopt?
First, you must maintain a strict wake and sleep schedule. Going to bed and getting up at the exact same time every single day, including weekends, locks in your circadian rhythm and eliminates that social jet lag.
That sounds tough to do on weekends, but obviously necessary. What else?
Second, you need immediate morning sunlight exposure. Getting outside for just 15 minutes shortly after waking hits those daytime receptors in the eye and tells your master clock that the day has officially begun. Third, you have to respect the half-life of caffeine.
Right, because it takes hours to clear the receptors.
You need to stop consuming caffeine at least 6 to 8 hours before your intended bedtime, ensuring those receptors are clear when you actually need to sleep. Fourth, optimize your physical environment. You need to keep the bedroom remarkably cool and completely dark.
Why does the room need to be cool?
The brain needs to drop its core temperature by about 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit to initiate and maintain deep sleep. A cold room heavily facilitates that biological drop. Finally, ensure you finish any intense physical exercise a few hours before sleeping, allowing your core body temperature and stress hormones to return to baseline.
When you look at all of these mechanisms together, from the chemical pressure building up during the day to the emotional filtering to the physical repair of the heart and the literal washing of the brain tissue, it fundamentally demands a shift in how we value rest.
It requires a complete paradigm shift. For too long, society has viewed sleep as a luxury, a sign of weakness, or simply lost time. But the science proves that sleep is the exact opposite. It is a fundamental, non-negotiable biological investment in your waking life.
It really is the foundation of everything we do.
It is the sophisticated, built-in maintenance period that dictates your emotional resilience, your cognitive sharpness, and your long-term physical health. Without it, every single system breaks down. With it, every system thrives.
It leaves me with a truly fascinating question to consider. If 97% of us are biologically incapable of thriving on short sleep, yet our entire modern corporate educational and social structure demands that we do exactly that, are we building a society that is fundamentally incompatible with human neurology?
That is exactly the kind of provocative question we need to be asking as we rethink our relationship with rest. Thanks for listening to TalkKast.